High above the gray coastline of British Columbia, an aging seaplane pilot thought he was enjoying one last quiet flight before the storm rolled in. But the K-9 at his side suddenly shot upright, whining sharply and clawing at the window as if warning him of something waiting below. When Ethan tilted the plane for a closer look, a massive SOS appeared on an island long marked as nonexistent. He had no idea that landing there would pull him and his loyal dog into a darkness no one had ever uncovered. The engine's hum wrapped around the little seaplane like a blanket, a steady vibration running through metal, seat frames, and bone. Ethan Ward sat behind the yoke as if welded there, eyes moving from horizon to gauges in a rhythm he no longer had to think about. Below him, the broken coastline of British Columbia stretched in jagged fingers of rock and dark pines, disappearing into a thin gray haze. Beside him, buckled into the co-pilot's seat, Ranger slept the way only a working dog could sleep, fully relaxed and fully ready. The Belgian Malinois had his head resting between his paws, ears tipped forward just enough to catch subtle changes in the world. Every bump of turbulence rocked him gently, but his breathing stayed deep and even, matching the drone of the prop. Ethan glanced at him the way a man glances at a clock he trusts more than his own sense of time. Ranger's chest rose and fell, steady. Good. When the dog was calm, the sky stayed simple. When the dog reacted, things changed. Ethan shifted his grip on the yoke and let his gaze drift ahead, chasing the thin line where clouds met water, keeping his mind away from the desert sun and the smell of jet fuel that still lived in his nightmares. 3,000 feet up, the world felt clean. No phones, no sirens, no one calling his name through a headset, asking for a decision he could never take back. Just the float plane, the air, the endless patchwork of islands and water lanes he'd flown 100 times. The route was muscle memory now, a loop he traced 3 times a week, as if drawing a fence around his own head. The only voice that broke the quiet came through the headset from time to time. "You still with us out there, Ward?" It was Jake from the little harbor back in town, a part-time mechanic and full-time worrier. Ethan would answer with a dry, "Yeah, just me and the dog," and Jake would laugh, say something about not scaring the eagles, then click off. The chatter kept the edges of Ethan's thoughts from fraying. Today, even that chatter had faded. The weather report had been good, and the sky for once listened. No squall lines, no sudden fog banks rolling in from nowhere, just thin clouds and scraps of sunlight sliding across the water. Ethan checked fuel, altitude, engine temperature, everything square. He let himself breathe a little deeper, shoulders loosening against the harness straps. Ranger twitched once in his sleep, a back paw, kicking at some invisible thing he was chasing. Ethan's mouth edged into the faintest smile. He reached over, the glove of his right hand finding the rough fur at the dog's neck, giving a quick, absent-minded scratch. "Easy day, buddy," he muttered. The words were lost in engine noise, but the tone meant more than the sound. For a second, it felt true. Then, so fast Ethan almost missed the moment it turned, the dog froze. Ranger's muscles tightened under Ethan's fingertips, the warm, loose weight of him changing into something coiled and alert. His ears snapped upright, eyes snapping open like someone had thrown a switch. Ethan pulled his hand back automatically, a ripple of unease sliding up his spine. Ranger didn't bark. He never wasted sound when he didn't have to. Instead, he rose, pushing against the harness until the straps went taut across his chest. His nose pressed to the side window, breath fogging the glass in quick bursts. A low, urgent whine slipped out of him, almost swallowed by the engine's rumble, but Ethan heard it. He always heard that sound. "Hey," Ethan said sharply, half to get the dog's attention, half to steady himself. He checked his panel again, as if the instruments might tell him what Ranger already knew. Oil steady, Fuel good. No warning lights. The world inside the cockpit was perfect. The dog was staring outside. Ethan swallowed and rolled the plane slightly, banking just enough for Ranger to have a better view of whatever had caught him. The whine grew higher, and Ranger's paws thudded against the lower edge of the window, claws ticking on plastic. He wasn't looking at the endless open water. His gaze was locked on a cluster of dark shapes ahead, a small arc of rock and trees Ethan knew by habit. An uninhabited island, one of dozens he'd marked in his head as nothing but rock and pine. He'd flown over it so many times that it barely registered anymore. He dipped the wing a little more, irritation poking through the thin shell of his calm. "There's nothing there, Ranger. Easy." He said it like he believed it, but his eyes were already sliding from the dog's tense shoulders to the waterline of the island. Spruce, rock face. A narrow crescent of pale sand that usually looked like a forgotten fingernail clipping against the steel-blue ocean. Today, the sand didn't look empty. Ethan blinked once, then leaned toward the glass, the headset pressing into his temple. The little crescent of beach was carved by something too straight, too deliberate to belong to tide or wind. 3 enormous letters, bright against the darker sand, were laid out in a clear human pattern. SOS seashells or driftwood, he couldn't tell from this height, but it screamed one thing. Someone down there wanted to be seen. His chest tightened, a reflex that had nothing to do with altitude. The cockpit shrank for a second, the hum of the engine bending into the ghost of another sound entirely. Radios. Crackling, someone yelling coordinates, a voice in his ear that wasn't there anymore. Ethan forced a slow breath in through his nose, out through his mouth, eyes fixed on the island. Ranger shifted again, turning from the window to stare straight at him, amber eyes bright and fierce. There was no doubt in that look, no room for excuses or retreat. For years, the dog had been his early warning system for storms, engine troubles, even his own panic attacks. Ranger knew when Ethan was slipping before Ethan did. Now the dog's gaze said something else, something he couldn't duck. They need help. You see it? Do something. Ethan's hand tightened on the yoke until his knuckles went pale. He could fly past. He could pretend he hadn't seen the sign, tell himself it was old, that the sea had a way of keeping ghosts around long after the living were gone. But the problem was simple and brutal. Ranger had seen it too. The dog had reacted as if someone had shouted in his ear. Ignoring the island would mean ignoring the one creature he trusted more than his own judgment. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a surrender he didn't name. "All right, Ranger," he murmured, the words for the dog, for himself, for whatever waited on that strip of sand. He eased the throttle back and nudged the nose of the seaplane down. Outside, the island grew larger, details sharpening, the white slash of the SOS burning against the shore. Inside, the steady rhythm of Ethan's ritual cracked, and for the first time in a long time, the sky did not feel empty at all. The seaplane drifted toward the inlet in a slow, steady glide, the floats skimming the surface with a soft hiss that broke the ocean's quiet. Ethan eased the throttle down, letting the little Cessna settle into the water as gently as he could, though his pulse hammered like he'd just landed in combat. Ranger stood braced beside him, paws planted wide, muscles tight beneath his coat. He didn't look at Ethan. His eyes were locked on the shoreline ahead. When the engine finally cut off, the silence hit harder than the landing. No hum, no vibration. Just the faint slap of waves against metal and the whisper of wind brushing the treetops. Ethan felt the quiet closing in around him, heavy and unnatural, as if the island were holding its breath. Ranger lifted his nose, scenting the air in quick bursts, the fur along his spine lifting in a slow ripple that made Ethan's stomach knot. He climbed out first, boots thudding softly against the float, testing the balance before signaling Ranger. The dog moved with careful precision, hopping down onto the damp sand, his tail rigid, ears pricked forward in sharp angles. Ethan followed with a dry bag slung over his shoulder, gaze sweeping the stretch of beach. Up close, the SOS was even more unsettling. Each shell placed with deliberate hands, arranged in perfect lines like someone trying to scream without sound. No footprints ran beside it. No signs of a camp. Nothing but the long arc of pale sand and the looming wall of stone and pine behind it. Ethan crouched, brushing a hand across the shells. Fresh. Not long exposed to weather. Ranger circled behind him, nose low, sweeping wide arcs back and forth, his breath sharp and focused. The dog stopped once, head turning toward the cliff face, as if listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. The stillness pressed at Ethan's ears. He reached for his radio with a reflexive flick, thumbing the button. "Harbor Base, this is Ward. You copy?" Only static answered, a long, empty hiss. He tried again, adjusting frequency, switching channels, but every attempt met the same dead noise. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't look away from the cliffs. Ethan frowned, raising the radio higher, angling it toward the sky. Nothing changed. He set the radio down slowly, mind turning. The cliffs around the inlet formed a high, uneven ring, nature's own signal trap. No wonder the SOS hadn't been answered. Anyone stuck here would have been shouting into a void. Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw, feeling the old pressure in his chest start to tighten again, the one that came whenever trouble crept too close to memory. Ranger let out a soft, uncertain whine, brushing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg as if sensing the shift. They moved inland, the dog leading naturally, slipping into his working stride, nose guiding him over sand, driftwood, broken shells. Ethan followed, scanning everything Ranger ignored. A folded patch of seaweed was scraped aside. A half-buried rope lay twisted near a rock. Then, half hidden under a scatter of kelp, Ethan spotted something else, a rectangular hunk of orange plastic with a cracked screen and torn strap. He lifted it, brushed the sand off. A personal locator beacon. Government issue. Not fishing gear, not something you'd find on a tourist. Ethan turned it over, noticing the deep gouges in the casing as if someone had slammed it against rock. Ranger padded up beside him, sniffing the device once, before turning sharply toward the tree line, his entire body going still. Ethan straightened, the device heavy in his hand. The forest edge loomed darker than it should have, thick branches forming a shadowed curtain. Ranger crept toward it, each paw placed silently, tail lowered, shoulders angled forward like a drawn bowstring. Ethan followed, boots crunching lightly on gravel. A cold draft spilled out from between the trees, carrying a smell sour and metallic beneath the usual pine, something that did not belong to an empty island. Ranger stopped again, head tilted as if catching a sound Ethan couldn't. The dog's body braced, front legs stiff, breath held. Ethan slowly reached for the flashlight attached to his vest, though he didn't switch it on yet. He didn't want to announce his presence until he had to. Ranger took one more step, nose almost touching the moss-covered ground, and let out a low, warning growl that vibrated more in his chest than in the air. Ethan felt the hairs on his own arms prickle. Ranger rarely growled. When he did, it was never for nothing. The dog suddenly cut left, moving along the forest edge, tracing an angle as if following a broken scent trail. Ethan quickened his pace, heart thudding harder. The sand changed under his boots, shifting to dirt and needles. Something glinted beneath a fallen branch. A coil of wire snapped at the end, the kind used for securing equipment cases. The dog halted again so abruptly that Ethan almost stumbled into him. Ranger stared straight ahead, jaw tight, breath steady. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze and saw a narrow break in the pines, a path barely wide enough for a person to slip through. It looked untouched by animals, too straight and too clean, as if someone had forced their way through recently, brushing branches aside in haste. He felt the first real chill crawl across his spine. Ranger pressed closer to him, body angled protectively between Ethan and the dark opening. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Waves behind them soft and steady, trees ahead unmoving, air holding the taste of something not right. Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight, feeling the weight of the island settling around him. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though his voice was low and tight. Ranger didn't relax. He didn't blink. The dog stood rooted there, staring into that narrow trail, as if whatever waited deeper in the woods had already seen them long before they saw it. The forest swallowed them slowly, the light thinning with every step, turning the air cooler and the shadows heavier. Ethan moved with care, pushing aside low branches, but Ranger slipped through the undergrowth like he'd been born in places where sunlight rarely reached. The dog's ears flicked constantly, mapping sounds Ethan couldn't hear, and every so often his nose lifted, catching scents the wind barely carried. The trail wasn't a real trail, just a narrow press of broken ferns and bent grass, as if someone had forced their way through in a hurry. Ethan crouched to study a snapped stem, the break still green and wet. Ranger came back to him, touching his shoulder once before gliding ahead again, tail stiff, posture low. The dog wasn't curious. He was working, and that made Ethan's pulse tighten. A few yards deeper, the trees opened just enough for gray light to pool on the forest floor. Ranger froze at the edge of the clearing, head slightly angled, eyes locked on something ahead. Ethan followed his stare. A cluster of canvas tents stood in a small semicircle, their sides flapping softly in the breeze. Tables lay overturned, papers stuck to the dirt by damp, and a metal case sat cracked open, its contents spilled like a burst vein. Ethan stepped into the clearing slowly, scanning every corner. It wasn't a campsite abandoned over time. This was a camp ripped apart. Stove lay on its side. A folding chair had one leg bent nearly in half. Small boot prints dotted the ground, some deep with panic, some skidding as if someone had been dragged. Ranger moved between the debris with precision, his nose sweeping every object, tail dipping when he found something troubling. Near the center, a waterproof camera lay on its back, lens cracked but still blinking with a struggling red light. Ethan hesitated, then picked it up, brushing pine needles from the small screen. With a quick breath, he pressed play. The video flickered to life, jarring footage of a young woman, her face streaked with dirt, hair plastered to her forehead. She whispered hoarsely into the lens, "If anyone finds this, please, don't trust." A crash sounded behind her. She turned, eyes wide. "They're not fishermen. Run!" The recording ended in a smear of motion and a muffled scream. Ethan lowered the camera slowly. Ranger let out a low, uneasy rumble, nudging Ethan's knee as if to anchor him. The name tag lying on the ground near the tent flap read, "Grace Miller," clipped to a torn lanyard. Ethan picked it up, thumb brushing over the cracked plastic. He'd been on enough searches to recognize desperation when he saw it. This was no accident, no storm panic. Someone had been hunted here. A short distance away, something metallic caught the fading light. Ethan moved toward it, pushing aside a torn poncho. Underneath lay a slim tablet sealed in a waterproof case, the screen spidered with fractures, but still glowing faintly. A map was open, layers of ocean current readings, depth markers, and coordinates plotted offshore. Ranger sniffed the case and recoiled slightly, as if the plastic carried more than scent. Fear, maybe, or the memory of hands shaking as they handled it. Above them, a pair of ravens burst from a branch with harsh calls, sending brittle needles raining down. Ranger snapped his head upward, then toward the far edge of the clearing. He stood rigid, every muscle sharp and ready. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight. At first he saw nothing but the thick mesh of branches. Then, just for a heartbeat, a flash of reflected light. Not natural, not accidental, the kind of glint made by glass or metal. Someone was watching them. Ethan slowly reached for his knife, easing it free without sound. Ranger shifted, weight dropping into his hind legs, ready to spring. The forest held its breath, wind stalling, branches stilling. Ethan stepped closer to Ranger, whispering under the sound of his own pulse, "Stay close." The dog didn't move, eyes locked on the tree line, breath silent and controlled. The glint vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the dark. But the feeling it left behind clung to the air. Their presence on the island wasn't just noticed, it was expected. Ethan quietly slipped the tablet into his pack, scanning the shadows where the watcher had been. Ranger's ears twitched again, then lowered slightly, signaling danger was no longer in sight, but far from gone. Ethan knelt beside the dog, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Ranger didn't relax, but he didn't growl either. He was waiting, listening, processing. Ethan drew a long breath, the cool air sharp with pine and the faint metallic tang of old tools. He had no radio, no signal, no backup. But he had Ranger. And after everything he'd seen in the clearing, that was the only certainty he trusted. They stepped back toward the forest edge, Ranger leading with silent, deliberate steps. Behind them, the ruined camp stood like a warning. Whatever had torn through this place hadn't finished its work. As Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time, the wind pushed the flap of a tent open, revealing a streak of dried blood darkening the canvas floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him the SOS hadn't been a plea from the past. Someone was still out there. Someone who'd fought to survive. Someone who hadn't given up yet. Ranger turned to look at Ethan, eyes bright and unwavering. Without a word, the dog pressed forward into the trees, as if saying, "We're not too late." The fog drifted in from the shoreline like a thin gray sheet, softening the shapes of trees and swallowing sound until every footstep felt absorbed by damp air. Ethan moved slowly, scanning between the trunks, while Ranger stayed just ahead of him, muscles tight, tail low, ears pivoting with razor focus. The dog kept glancing back, as if reminding Ethan that whatever lingered in this part of the island wasn't far. They stepped out of the thicker brush and into a patch of lighter mist where the air shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of sweat, old salt, and something metallic. Ranger froze first, his body locked in place, chest lifted, nose tilted upward. A low warning rumble trembled through him, not loud but deep enough to vibrate against the quiet around them. A shape stumbled out from behind a moss-covered stump, tall, limping, one arm wrapped around his torso. He looked almost swallowed by the fog. His clothes were torn, stained with dried blood across the shoulder. For a moment, he blinked at Ethan like a man waking from a nightmare. "Hey, wait, don't shoot," he rasped, lifting his empty hand with trembling fingers. "Name's Cole Becker. I've been out here 2 days." Ethan didn't draw a weapon, but he didn't step closer either. Ranger stepped in front of him, the dog's stance turning solid and immovable, like a barrier placed by instinct alone. Cole saw the dog and raised his hands a little higher. "Easy, buddy. I'm not your problem," he murmured, voice shaking in a way that didn't quite match the alert brightness in his eyes. Cole swayed, catching himself on a low branch, breath hitching as if each inhale burned. "Storm hit my boat," he said, forcing the words out. "Got blown off course. Smashed on the rocks. I saw the camp up ahead. Tried to get help." His gaze darted toward the direction of the ruined tents, then back to Ethan. "Whatever hit that camp, those weren't fishermen. You saw the gear? You saw what they did." Ranger didn't relax. Instead, he edged sideways, positioning his body so he could block Cole while still keeping Ethan within reach. The dog's nose twitched sharply, tasting the air around the man. Ethan watched Ranger's reaction more than Cole's story. The injury on Cole's shoulder looked real enough, but something in his stance, too balanced, too aware, made Ethan hold back. Cole noticed the hesitation and swallowed hard. "Look, I know how it sounds," he said, lowering himself to sit against a tree, wincing but keeping his eyes on Ethan. "I heard screaming that night. I heard people running through the brush. Then, nothing. I hid until daylight and tried to find my way toward the beach, but I couldn't risk lighting a fire." His voice cracked, but the dog remained unconvinced. Ranger crept a half-step closer, head low, ears angled forward. His tail didn't wag, didn't flick. He simply stared at Cole with a focus that made the man shift nervously. "He's a working dog, right?" Cole asked, forcing a laugh that died quickly. "He's reading me like I'm hiding something. I promise, I'm not." Ethan finally knelt beside Ranger, placing a steadying hand along the dog's back. Ranger didn't move from his position, but his growl softened into a tense, vibrating hum. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Ethan said quietly. Cole closed his eyes as though gathering pieces of memory, then nodded. "Two men, big, hard-looking. They had gear that wasn't for fishing, military cases, heavy tools. I didn't get a good look, but they weren't here to save anyone." Ranger's nose lifted sharply, picking up a new scent rolling in on a soft breeze. He turned his head toward the tree line behind Cole, body shifting into a defensive angle. Ethan felt the dog tense under his hand. Something, or someone, was close enough for Ranger to track. Cole opened his eyes, following the dog's stare, panic rising across his features. From the darkness between the trees, a faint crack echoed, a twig snapping under deliberate weight. Not the wind, not an animal. Ranger responded instantly, stepping forward with a deep bark that shattered the fog stillness. Ethan rose beside him, scanning the woods, heart hammering. The forest gave no answer, only leaning back into silence as if retreating from what had given itself away. Cole pushed himself upright, fear shaking in his breath. "You see? I told you. They're still here." He staggered closer, one hand out, as if pleading to be believed. Ranger blocked him again, firm as stone. Ethan didn't push the dog aside. Ranger had never misread danger in his life. The fog thickened around them, and somewhere far off, a gull cried, a lonely, stretched-out sound that gave the moment a hollow edge. Ethan kept his eyes on the dark woods. Whoever had been watching the camp hadn't gone far, and now they knew Ethan was here too. Ranger stepped back to Ethan's side, brushing against the back of his leg, ready for whatever came next. With slow movements, Ethan nodded toward the thinner trail leading toward a safer clearing. "We move," he murmured. Cole swallowed and followed, clutching his shoulder. Ranger stayed close, head turning constantly, tracking every shift in the air. The dog's steady tension told Ethan everything he needed to know. This island held more than ruins and shadows. It held eyes, and those eyes were watching all three of them. The clearing settled into an uneasy quiet as dusk thickened, washing the campsite in a soft blue-gray that made every broken tent pole look sharper and every shadow feel closer. Ethan built a small, smokeless fire from leftover camp scraps, more for light than warmth. Ranger stayed beside him, posture tense, eyes shifting between the trees like he expected the woods to move. Cole sat a few yards away, back braced against an overturned crate, one hand pressed dramatically to his bandaged shoulder. He winced with every breath, though his eyes wandered too often, too alert for a man supposedly near collapse. Ranger noticed. His ears flicked, nose lifting the moment Cole shifted, reading the man with the same intensity he used on storms and danger. As the fire cracked softly, night closed in fully. The fog lifted just enough to reveal a sliver of moonlight threading through the branches. Ethan tightened his jacket and watched Ranger's silhouette, the dog stiff as carved stone. Ranger didn't rest his head, didn't settle, didn't blink for more than a second. His body telegraphed one message. Something wasn't right. Cole cleared his throat, voice low and shaky. "Do you think whoever came through here is still around?" He spoke to fill the silence, but even his words felt thin. Ethan didn't answer right away. Ranger's reaction mattered more than Cole's fear, and the dog hadn't taken his eyes off the darkness. Finally, Ethan said, "Feels like it." Cole shivered, pulling his knees closer. The forest answered with its own voice, a soft crunch, then another, the deliberate weight of something stepping on pine needles. Ranger rose instantly, hackles lifting, tail pointed straight behind him. His rumble rolled through the clearing like distant thunder. Ethan stood, flashlight ready, scanning the tree line. The sound drifted away, swallowed, as if whoever made it knew exactly how close they could come. Cole pushed himself upright, breath hitching as he peered into the dark. "You heard that, right? That wasn't an animal." Ethan didn't look at him. "Stay put." Ranger moved a few steps forward, paused silent on the dirt, nose tasting the air. His stance sharpened, shoulders angled, eyes locked on the same spot where the glint had appeared earlier that day. Minutes stretched, the fire burning low. Ranger circled back, brushing against Ethan's leg in a silent confirmation. Danger wasn't gone, only waiting. Cole watched them both, anxiety flickering across his face. "You think they'll come back?" he whispered. Ethan almost answered, but Ranger beat him to it with a low chuff, the kind he used when warning Ethan to stay alert. Cold crept into the clearing, settling across their shoulders like damp cloth. Ethan added 2 small branches to the fire, enough to keep the shadows at bay, but not enough to reveal their exact location. Ranger settled beside him again, but his body stayed rigid. Every few minutes, his nose lifted, tracking scents shifting through the night air, salt, old gear, and something faintly metallic. Cole tried again, voice trembling. "I swear I'm telling you the truth, man. I wouldn't lie. I didn't do anything." But Ranger didn't look at him. The dog kept staring past the man, deep into the trees, as though Cole wasn't the threat, but something waiting behind him. Ethan noticed the tension knotting in his gut the same way it had in the desert years ago. The fire dimmed into glowing embers. Shadows crawled toward them. Ranger stood once more, posture low and ready, tail stiff with purpose. Ethan followed his gaze and caught a flicker of movement. Small, fast, like someone pulling back behind a tree. Before he could react, a soft click echoed through the clearing. Not a twig, not an animal. A boot on rock. Ranger barked, sharp and explosive, the kind of bark he saved for imminent threat. Ethan grabbed Cole's jacket and pulled him down, just as a stone tumbled from the hillside, rolling into the clearing. Whoever had been watching had retreated again, but not quietly. Cole stared, wide-eyed. "Someone's hunting us," he whispered. Ranger stayed fixed on the dark ridge, the firelight glinting in his eyes. The night stretched long after that, filled with quiet sniffs from Ranger, distant footfalls, and the heavy breath of 3 people too afraid to speak. Eventually, Cole's voice thinned to nothing, his fear pulling him into a shallow, restless sleep. Ethan didn't sleep. Ranger didn't sleep. The dog stayed at Ethan's side, unmoving, ears twitching at every rustle, every shift of the wind. By the time the sky softened into the faint gray of early dawn, the forest finally loosened its grip on the night. The watcher was gone, at least for now. Ranger exhaled a long, slow breath and leaned gently against Ethan's knee, not relaxed, but no longer coiled tight. Ethan rubbed the dog's neck, grateful for the quiet. But he knew the truth. The island hadn't calmed. It had simply decided to wait. Morning came slowly, slipping through the treetops in thin, pale threads that softened the rough edges of the clearing. Ethan rose stiffly from where he'd kept watch, the last embers of the fire fading, into gray dust. Ranger stretched beside him, shaking off the long night with a ripple of muscle, though the dog's eyes still carried the tension of something unfinished. Cole stirred where he sat, hunched against the crate, blinking at the early light as if he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. Ethan watched him quietly, noting how the man's first instinct wasn't pain, but a quick glance around the trees, as if checking whether something had followed him into morning. Ranger noticed, too, stepping subtly between Ethan and Cole, tail hanging low. The air smelled different today, cooler, metallic, as though the ground itself held a story ready to surface. Ranger lifted his nose, catching a thread of scent woven through the breeze. His ears twitched forward once, twice, and then he turned sharply toward the beach, body alert. Ethan recognized that signal, a scent the dog trusted even if Ethan didn't know it yet. Without a sound, Ranger moved toward the shoreline, paws quick and deliberate over the pine needles. Ethan followed, calling a quiet warning over his shoulder for Cole to stay put. Cole didn't argue. He looked almost relieved to see them leave, sinking back into the shadow of the tent. Ethan didn't miss that reaction. Ranger certainly didn't. They crossed the tree line and stepped into a wide sweep of sand washed clean by low tide. Ranger trotted ahead, nose skimming the ground in a zigzag that grew tighter, sharper. Then his pace changed. He locked onto a point near the middle of the beach and began digging with focused urgency, sand flying behind him in frantic bursts. Ethan felt his pulse climb. Ranger never dug without reason. He moved closer, kneeling beside the dog. Ranger didn't slow. His chest heaved with determination, paws scraping deeper until sand gave way to fabric, dark, heavy, waterlogged. Ethan brushed the sand aside and froze as a sleeve emerged, then a pale hand bound at the wrist. His breath tightened. This wasn't debris. It was a body. Ranger stepped back, ears flattening with a soft, mournful whine. Ethan pulled the remaining sand away until the uniform patch became visible. United States Oceanic Research Institute. The same group Grace belonged to. The man's skin was cold, his clothes stiff, as though he had been buried in a hurry. But what struck Ethan hardest was the angle of the wrists, tied behind him. Not lost, not drowned. Hidden. Ranger sniffed the body gently, then turned toward Ethan with a low growl that vibrated through the sand beneath them. The dog's hackles rose, not in fear but in certainty. Someone hadn't just left this man. Someone had wanted him covered, undisturbed. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting the rise of guilt and anger in his chest. He searched the pockets carefully, fingers trembling slightly, until they brushed against something crumpled. A torn scrap of waterproof paper, smeared with dirt but still legible. Ethan unfolded it and read the short, desperate message written in shaky ink. Cole is one of them. Don't trust him. Grace is alive. The wind seemed to still at that moment. Ranger stiffened beside him, staring back toward the tree line where Cole waited. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the truth settle across his shoulders like wet stone. Cole hadn't stumbled to them. He'd found them. And he wasn't alone on this island. Ranger stood guard by the body, eyes shifting rapidly between Ethan and the distant camp, as if waiting for the next command. But Ethan didn't move yet. He needed a breath, a single moment to let the betrayal sharpen into focus. Ranger stepped closer, nudging Ethan's elbow gently, grounding him the way he had done so many times before. Finally, Ethan rose. The body on the beach lay half-covered again, untouched except for the small patch he'd uncovered. "We can't stay here," he whispered, more to Ranger than himself. The dog nodded in his own way, stepping close and pressing a steady weight against Ethan's leg, ready for whatever came next. Together they began the slow walk back to the clearing, the sand whispering beneath their boots and paws. Ethan's mind raced ahead, but Ranger kept watch to the sides, alert to scents shifting in the air. The island no longer felt silent. It felt awake, stirred by what Ranger had unearthed. And somewhere beyond the trees, Cole waited, unaware that the ground beneath his lies had finally cracked open. The forest thickened as Ethan and Ranger moved farther from the beach, the air cooling into a muted stillness. Ranger led without hesitation, nose close to the ground, every step purposeful. The dog's steady pace told Ethan one thing clearly. The scent he'd picked up wasn't faint or old. Whoever he was tracking had passed through recently. They pushed through a curtain of ferns, stepping onto a narrow rise that overlooked a stretch of broken coastline. Far below, waves crashed into jagged stone, sending mist swirling into the air. Ranger paused at the ridge, sniffing deeply, then turned sharply downhill toward the rocks as if the wind had carried a name only he could hear. Ethan followed carefully, boots slipping on loose shale. Ranger moved with practiced agility, weaving down the slope until the sound of the ocean grew louder and deeper. Ahead, a dark opening gaped in the cliff, a cave hidden behind fallen stone and thick seaweed, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. Ranger didn't hesitate. He trotted straight toward the mouth of the cave. Inside, the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, tinged with salt and damp earth. Ranger's paws splashed through shallow pools as he lowered his head, tasting the scents trapped in the stillness. Ethan switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting a pale path over the rough walls. The light caught scuff marks on the floor, signs of dragging, signs of struggle. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from deeper within. Ethan froze. Ranger's ears shot forward, body stiffening into a single line of concentration. The tapping came again, soft but desperate, like someone using the last of their strength to signal hope. Ranger didn't wait for permission. He moved forward, paws quiet on the stone, following the sound. The tunnel narrowed before widening into a chamber washed in weak light, leaking through cracks in the ceiling. In the middle of the small cavern lay a woman bound at the wrists and ankles, her hair tangled, her skin pale from cold and exhaustion. Ranger reached her first, nose brushing her cheek as he let out a gentle whine. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Grace," Ethan whispered, dropping to her side. The name felt heavy now, no longer just a label on a torn badge, but a survivor fighting to stay conscious. "We're getting you out." Grace inhaled shakily, tears mixing with salt water on her face. "He's not who he says," she rasped. "Cole? He set us up. He hurt Evan. He tried to take the drives." Ethan cut the ropes carefully, hands steady even as anger tightened every muscle in his chest. Ranger stayed pressed against Grace, letting her grip his fur for balance. When she tried to sit, Ethan supported her carefully. "Where's Evan?" he asked. Grace shook her head, eyes wide with fear. "They dragged him inland. I couldn't stop them." Further along the cave wall, Ethan noticed deep gouges scratched into the stone, marks left by someone imprisoned long before Grace's team arrived. The history in those lines was unmistakable. This island had been used to hide more than research equipment. Ranger sniffed the marks, backing away with a low, uneasy growl. Grace clutched Ethan's sleeve suddenly. "You can't trust Cole," she whispered. "He pretended to help. Then he heard your plane. He said it was his chance to get off the island." Ranger reacted instantly to her fear, stepping between her and the cave entrance as if expecting Cole to appear at any moment. His tail lowered, his body coiled. Ethan helped Grace to her feet, guiding her slowly toward the tunnel. Ranger stayed ahead, pausing every few steps to check the darkness. Outside, the sky had begun to shift, heavy clouds gathering over the water, another storm building on the horizon. The island felt smaller all of a sudden, as if time itself were closing in around them. They reached the cave mouth and paused. Grace leaned heavily on Ethan, breathing hard, but her voice carried determination. "Evan's still alive. I know it." Ranger nudged her hand, offering silent reassurance, then looked up at Ethan with a steady, focused gaze. waiting for direction, ready to find whoever was left. With the wind rising and the first hint of rain tapping the stones, Ethan tightened his grip on Grace's arm and nodded. "We move now." Ranger lowered his head, caught the scent again, and stepped forward into the storm-lit path. The island had shown them its darkest corners, but Ranger was ready to lead them into whatever came next. The storm gathered slowly above them as Ethan, Grace, and Ranger pushed through the thinning forest. The wind carried the scent of rain and brine, brushing past their faces like a quiet warning. Ranger stayed ahead, his movement sharper now, nose lifting every few steps, as if reading the air for dangers they hadn't yet seen. They reached the edge of the trees just as the beach came into view. Ethan spotted the seaplane rocking lightly in the rising tide, its red and white frame flashing under the shifting sky. Grace sagged with relief, whispering Evan's name under her breath. Ranger nudged her hand gently before returning to his watchful stance, muscles tight beneath his coat. Ethan helped Grace toward the float, supporting her weight carefully. She was exhausted, but determined, clinging to the hope that Evan was still alive somewhere on this island. Ranger circled them, gaze sweeping the tree line with unwavering focus. The dog's ears twitched at every sound, every shift of wind, as though the earth itself was whispering a warning he alone could understand. Just as Ethan reached for the plane's door, Ranger stopped cold. His body stiffened, tail dropped, and a deep growl rumbled from his chest, vibrating through the sand. Ethan froze, following the dog's stare toward the dark mouth of the forest. Grace clutched Ethan's arm, breath catching. A shadow separated itself from the trees and stepped into the open. Cole limped forward, shotgun in hand, the storm wind whipping through his torn jacket. His expression twisted between desperation and fury, the mask of the frightened survivor gone. "You were supposed to help me," he spat, raising the barrel toward Ethan. "But you had to dig. You just had to keep digging." Ranger barked once, sharp, explosive, placing himself between Ethan and the gun. Ethan slowly lifted one hand, palm exposed, the other inching toward his belt, though he knew he wouldn't reach his knife in time. Cole's breath came fast and ragged, anger shaking through him. "That plane gets me off this island," he hissed, "and if you think I'm letting you take it—" He steadied his aim, finger tightening on the trigger. Ranger crouched, every muscle drawn like a loaded spring. In that narrow heartbeat, the world held still. The wind, the waves, even Ethan's breath. Cole shifted his stance to fire. Ethan whispered the only command Ranger needed. "Now!" The dog launched forward with a burst of pure force, cutting through the space between them like lightning. Cole shouted, firing a wild shot that cracked the air and slammed into the water behind Ranger. Ranger hit Cole's damaged leg with every pound of power in his body. The impact sent Cole sprawling into the surf, the shotgun flying from his grip and landing with a splash. Cole tried to rise, but the dog held him down, not with teeth, but with weight and a growl that left no room for resistance. Ethan rushed in, kicking the shotgun deeper into the water before grabbing Cole's collar and yanking him onto the sand. The storm winds roared overhead, drowning Cole's curses as Ethan secured him with tight knots from his emergency rope. Ranger stepped back at last, chest heaving, soaked from the spray. Grace whispered a soft, trembling, "Good boy," brushing her fingers over his wet fur. Ranger leaned into her touch for a brief second before returning to Ethan's side. Ethan turned back to the seaplane, lifting Grace aboard and settling her safely inside. He started the engine, the familiar roar cutting through the storm like a lifeline. Ranger leapt in after him, shaking water across the cabin, then settled into his seat, eyes still watching the beach as if expecting the island to reach for them one last time. Static filled the radio for a long moment before a clear voice broke through. A Coast Guard operator answering the call Ethan had almost given up on. Within minutes, the thudding beat of rotor blades swept across the shoreline. A bright orange helicopter descended through the storm, sending sand swirling as medics rushed toward the seaplane. Grace was lifted out first, wrapped in blankets, and guided toward safety. A second team secured Cole, hauling him away with stern silence. Ranger watched every movement, head tilted slightly, as if making sure justice was finally catching up to the man who had wronged so many. When the last medic nodded to Ethan, Ranger released a slow breath, letting the tension leave his body. As the helicopter rose, leaving only wind and fading echoes behind, Ethan stood beside Ranger on the damp sand. The storm eased just enough for a thin streak of light to break through the clouds, touching the water with a soft silver glow. Ranger pressed his head against Ethan's knee, letting out a low, contented sigh. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's back, the warmth grounding him after a day that had torn open every memory he'd spent years trying to bury. "Let's go home, buddy," he whispered. Ranger looked up at him, eyes bright, steady, and unafraid. Together they walked back toward the waiting seaplane, leaving the island and its secrets behind as the tide finally began to rise. Chakati, Chakia. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, let me know by dropping a simple comment. Even 0 or 1 is enough to tell me you're here and listening. Your voice matters more than you think, and if you'd like to join us for the next story, filled with new mysteries, loyal dogs, and moments that stay with you long after the video ends, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a lot more waiting for you, and I'd be honored to have you with us for the next chapter.